Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to your Lunch Break Live. My name is Ivana Harinkyu if you're new here, and if you're not, thank you so much for coming back. Today is Monday, August the 22nd, and today I am joined by our AL.com columnist, Roy S. Johnson. Now, Roy today is here to talk about a column that he published that is about executions in the state of Alabama, and specifically calling for a pause on state executions until, in your words, Roy, the state can, quote, kill responsibly. Now, I think that is such an interesting concept. It's an interesting take here that you have, Roy. I wanted to walk through that, especially in the aftermath of the July 28th execution of Joe Nathan James. We've done a lot of coverage of that execution on our website on AL.com. There's also been a lot of national coverage of that as well. So I think a lot of people are kind of up to speed on the basics of that case. But if you're not up to speed on the basics of that case, Joe James was put to death again on July the 28th by the state of Alabama via lethal injection for the August 1994 killing of his ex-girlfriend, Faith Hall. And it should be noted as well that Faith Hall's family, especially her two daughters, did call for the state to not execute Joe James, for them to instead allow him to serve out the remainder of his life behind bars. But the state did not go that route. The state did choose to execute him. Roy, I just wanted to give that quick kind of prelim into this conversation because it's important for your column for context here.
Sure.
So tell me a little bit about what you mean by the state needs to call off executions until they can do it responsibly.
So, Ivana, I was very intentional about using that word responsible. I use it because those are the words, that's the word that Governor Kay Ivey used when she justified not going by the wishes of the victim's daughters and not executing him, but allowing him to live the rest of his time behind bars. She said we were doing it, the state was doing it in the interest of being responsible to the law, to the public, and justice. So I used Kay Ivey's word to say, well, what about our responsibility to humanity? As you mentioned, there's been a lot of coverage of this execution, primarily for it being, in the words of many experts, botched. As you noted in your coverage of the execution, it was delayed for 3 hours, and we subsequently, over the next few days, learned it was delayed because of the challenges that state officials, that the executioners had in getting the IV into his arm. And it took several hours, and even you thought it was an unusual delay. Now, the next day, they did admit that there were some challenges there, but it was the Atlantic, based on an autopsy, a private autopsy that was approved by the family, that learned just how horrible things were in trying to get that IV into his arm. And so when we learned about that, I said, what about the responsibility to do it? If we're going to kill humanely. If we're going to do this, as my parents used to say, if you're going to do it right. Do it with responsibility, and don't just do a hatchet job, so to speak, on something that is already a difficult act for many people. So this was not a debate about the death penalty. You know, that's for another forum. This was a debate about, if we're going to do it right, and do it with humanity. One of the things that I learned in putting this together, and we talked about this, is that the insertion of the IV is done behind closed doors, behind a curtain. There is no transparency for that. The entire process should be transparent. This is a huge public act, and it should be transparent. But right now, there is no provision for that to be done in view of the witnesses. And for those of you, the media, who are there witnessing, what typically happens is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is when the curtain comes open, the person to be executed has already got the IV in their arm and already lying on the table. They are then asked if they have any last words to anyone, to the victims families, to anything, and then the action is taken until they are pronounced dead. In this case, as you noted, it was a 3-hour delay, and then the time between the curtain opening and closing was about 18 minutes or so, which seemed to be kind of rushed. And we subsequently learned that this was just a horrible execution of an execution. And I'm just saying, until they can figure out a way to do this right, put a pause on lethal injections. I didn't even say put a pause on all executions. Just put a pause on lethal injections until they decide whether they can do it right, do it with full transparency, or just not do it at all.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point you just noted is that you were saying to put a pause. Again, this is not a column that's debating the death penalty. We'll say this is a column debating if lethal injections in Alabama should continue again until you say that the state can, quote, kill responsibly. Now, what I think is interesting is that you mentioned that lethal injection kind of caveat there. You said, look, I'm calling on lethal injections to be paused. You didn't mention the newest approved method of execution in Alabama, which is death by nitrogen hypoxia. I should say execution by nitrogen hypoxia. That has been something that's a big topic we can talk about probably a later day because there's a lot of caveats there. But essentially, that execution method was approved several years ago. There are several dozen death row inmates who are allowed to opt into that method of execution. The state has been preparing a way and preparing what they call protocol to get that execution method ready to deploy. They have not given us a date. We actually asked at Joe James's execution when we got to speak with the commissioner after the execution. We asked, when will nitrogen hypoxia executions be able to begin? And they did not give a timeline there. They did say that they are close to getting that protocol finished, but they didn't give any type of a definite timeline. So for the future of executions in Alabama, all we know is that there is at least one more execution scheduled throughout, again, the foreseeable future. That is Alan Eugene Miller. He is set to die on September the 22nd, again at 6 p.m. at Holman facility in Atmore, Alabama, which is South Alabama. So that execution is coming up pretty quickly, Roy, just actually 1 month from today, looking at the calendar. So what do you think the state needs to do in that period of time from today until the 22nd? I mean, are you asking the department to go back and look at what happened, what you say was not responsible in Joe James's execution? What exactly are you looking for them to do?
Absolutely. They should already be doing that. They should look at what happened with James's execution and to ensure that it is not done that way again. And then to ensure the public that they are doing it responsibly. Look at these rules and regulations regarding transparency. To show us that they are doing it responsibly, again, to use the governor's own word. And it's interesting you mentioned the nitrogen option. Show us what you're doing. Don't just say you're working on it. Tell us other states are using it. Tell us why you can't do this in 30 days. Show us where you are in the progress of this process, and let us know exactly when you're going to be able to use it. Quite frankly, until I hear something different, I don't know if they're really working on it. I mean, I don't know if I believe them when they say that they are working through a process. Okay, maybe they are, but show us. Don't just tell us, show us. This state has a long history of just saying something and then not being transparent and showing that what they're saying is absolutely true. So for many of us who try to hold our leaders accountable, so just show us what you're doing in terms of developing this new process of execution. And also show us what you're doing to ensure that what happened to James does not happen to another human being in this state.
Well, and again, we should note that there have been no nitrogen hypoxia executions in the United States yet. That is something that is untried. So there's a lot of variables here. We don't exactly have a formula to know how that's going to work, right? We can't exactly just copy another
Right.
state, or we can't just say that this is the method that everybody's using. Let's jump on board. So there's a lot of variables to that. But going back to lethal injection here, something we should note as well, and we did I did some reporting on this last week. We can link that here. That all we have right now, you keep mentioning about what happened to James. Well, the state has not said anything that has happened to Joe James. We are waiting on that state autopsy,
No surprise
state toxicology.
No surprise.
We're waiting on all those state records. And the reason we're waiting on those state records is because they have to go to a grand jury before they're released. Now, it's a lot of, I'm sure people know, sometimes that can take a while, especially in these smaller sections of the state. Sometimes grand juries in larger counties meet pretty frequently, but then you get into these more rural areas or smaller areas of the state, they only meet maybe once every couple of months. So we're waiting on those state records of the autopsy. So right now we don't have any state records to say what happened to Joe James, other than that he died by lethal injection on the 28th. So still waiting on that there. Now, Roy, I have to quickly ask you, there's a lot of comments here of people saying, well, why should the state responsibly execute somebody when this inmate presumably did not responsibly kill their victim? What would you say to that comment?
just because someone else does something badly doesn't mean that you shouldn't hold yourself to your own standards. As a state, our public officials should hold themselves to the highest standard, no matter what it is. Whether it is we're looking at, I want to use an example. How we have people in this state who are without sewer systems, and we should hold ourselves to the highest standard to ensure that we treat all members of all citizens properly and humanely. So just because they did not act in a responsible way, that's no excuse for our public officials to act irresponsibly. Well, just my opinion. Yes, absolutely. Many people say, well, they weren't humane, so we shouldn't be humane. We should hold ourselves to a higher standard, particularly in a state that prides itself on its spirituality. I mean, talk about the dichotomy and the hypocrisy of screaming death in the name of justice, and then going to church on Sunday and praising Jesus, who preached nothing but forgiveness. So, that's something too that a lot of people don't want to bring into the conversation. And it's, again, not arguing against the death penalty here, just arguing for humanity, for treating people the way you would want to be treated, or, if that was your loved one, would want them to be treated.
Well, and there was again about a 3-hour delay from the scheduled execution time to when that execution started. The Department of Corrections later said that there were problems gaining intravenous access, which again is putting in that IV for those lethal drugs to be administered. Roy, that's about the only explanation they gave. We later asked the Department of Corrections if Joe James was conscious at the beginning of this execution, which is the protocol there, so that they can hear the death warrant and then have the opportunity to give any last words. And the department responded by saying that Joe James was not sedated. Those are very different things, to say that somebody was not sedated versus are they conscious. What's your take on that?
Just a mosh of words is what it is. They clearly did not answer your question, and you were there. He was asked if he had any final words and said nothing. Those who knew him, those who were around him, said that was not what James was planning to do. You quoted an attorney who represented him in some of his legal transactions, who said, no, that was not the James he knew. The Atlantic article quoted others as well that said James was actually even preparing words to say. So it seems to be unusual that, as you witnessed, James said nothing when asked if he had any final words before the execution would take place. So, and you were there. I mean, there were things that sort of tweaked your mind, because you've seen now you've witnessed 7 executions. So you kind of have a sense of how they should go. We also talked about the fact that in Alabama, they start them at 6 p.m., that they have to be finished by midnight, or that execution order is moot. Some other states started as early as 12:01 a.m., so they have 24 hours to get it right. There's nothing against Alabama saying, you know what, we're going to start earlier so we have opportunity to do this right. As you mentioned, there's nothing in the state code that says it has to start at 6 p.m. It could start at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, or whatever time it takes, to ensure that a rush job is not done in an inhumane fashion to execute this very, very difficult and challenging act.
Well, and I think that's important. You bring up kind of the timetable here. I think a lot of people at home who are not in the media, they're not working with the Department of Corrections and covering these things on a regular basis. Something that a lot of people might not know is, again, that death warrant, when somebody is given that warrant to be executed, that is only good for that one day that the Supreme Court of Alabama rules. And that one day begins at 12:01 a.m. and ends at midnight, or 11:59, we can say, if you want to argue about it. But there's that 24-hour period where that death warrant is good. If the state goes past that, the death warrant is not good. And then we've got a much bigger problem there. So I think it's interesting that you bring up that timetable here, because we look back several years ago at execution Doyle Ham. Again, that was several years ago before the pandemic. That execution ended up being called off because the Department of Corrections did have so much trouble finding a vein. And we should note that his attorney did argue that would be a problem due to Mr. Ham's medical conditions, pre-existing conditions at the time. but the department could not access a vein. They could not perform that central line procedure even. And the state ended up calling off the execution because they were cutting it a little bit too close to that period of time where even if they did get a vein and start that IV, get the central line going, that they would be very close to that midnight time frame. So it's just an interesting caveat here to note. And also what I think is important that you mentioned in your column, Roy, again, we're going to link it here if people haven't read it yet, but something interesting you note is the process of an inmate actually getting that IV started, getting that IV already in their arm and taped up and ready to go. That is only witnessed by Department of Corrections officials. There are not journalists who witness that. There are not lawyers for the inmate, if they have any, that are available to witness that. And I think it's important that you shine a light on that here, because that is something that, again, only the Department of Corrections witnesses.
What I think is if any good can come out of this, is that people are learning more about this process. It's easy to simplify it and say, here's the day of execution, they pull up a curtain, and it's done. This is a long process that begins, obviously, in the criminal justice system, and a lot happens before we get to that point where someone is actually executed. But I knew little about the actual process of execution. So it's good that we are learning more about how this happens. And as we learn more, and there will continue to be debate, we should be able to ask the difficult questions of why can't we do it better? Why can't we do it more efficiently? Why can't we do it, and I use this word again, more responsibly? Just because the inmate, the person to be executed, acted irresponsibly is no excuse for us to do the same. Our public officials need to be held to a higher standard in all things, and that includes this very controversial act of execution.
What does a responsible execution look like, Roy?
Again, humanely, we should be assured that the process, if we're going to use lethal injection, was done in a way that was humane, that was done efficiently. It was done by people who knew what they were doing, and it wasn't done in a way that was torturous, and again, not humane. So, but the only way we would know that is through transparency. If the entire process, I mean, we all go, many of us go and donate blood. I donate blood. We're in a room with a bunch of people. Someone has to get your vein, and we all see that process. Why not open that process up to transparency so that we are assured that our public officials are carrying this out in a responsible manner? Debate it whether or not we should do executions. That's a different context. That's a different forum. But if we're going to do it, I think we all, or most of us, would feel, okay, let's do it. Let's do it right. Let's do it responsibly, and then move on. So that is my only argument: is that we do this. If we're going to do it, and Alabama's clearly going to do it, that it's done responsibly and humanely.
Very interesting article this morning, Roy. Again, comes about 1 month almost since the execution of Joe James, and a month to the day ahead of the next scheduled Alabama execution of Alan Eugene Miller on September the 22nd. We're going to be covering that and covering everything leading up to that in the next month. So, Roy, again, thank you here for explaining this column a little bit to us, kind of clarifying your position here and telling us what went into your decision making in writing this. So thank you. Everybody watching, thank you so much. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye-bye. Thank you.